Hello everyone, Panzer J back with a new video. And this video is going to be on a game I haven't played in quite a while. This is Axis and Allies Global 1940. This came out in, I believe, 2007, 2008. There were two editions to it. The second edition I know came out in 2009. And this is, obviously, as the title of the game suggests, this takes place starting in 1940 and is the global edition. Now, it came out in two separate games, Pacific 1940 and Europe 1940. And clearly, Europe 1940 dealt with the war in the European theater, and Pacific 1940 dealt with the war in the Pacific. So, a little bit different than Historical Board Gaming's Global 39 that I've been playing almost exclusively for probably about the last 5 years or so. That game obviously starts in 1939 as opposed to this one in 1940. So some events of World War II are obviously already taken place, like Poland has already fell to Germany. Germany already has Romania and Hungary under its influence at this point in the conflict. So the Japanese also are a little bit further into China. But it's only a year difference in the start date. And it plays very similar to Global War 39. Now, this Axis and Allies game came out prior to, so the games that came out subsequently to this were kind of built off of this one, and things were expanded. Again, if you're kind of comparing this to Global 39, besides the start date, Global 39 has more units in the game, specialty units, as well as just different armor and planes as well. So just across the board, more units in general. Also, there's no, for instance, communist Chinese in this. It's just all the national Chinese. And then some of the rules are a little different. I would say Global 39 is more in depth. So if this is kind of like senior year in high school, so to speak, this Axis and Allies Global 40, I would say Historical Board Gaming's Global War 39 is more of a, college level game. But this game is still very cool. I didn't really stop playing it because I disliked it. Again, when it first came out, I used to play it quite a bit. But like I said, I just kind of graduated, so to speak, onto Global 39. But this game is still very cool. So this is the first time I probably played this since, I don't know, back in 2012, 2013, somewhere around there. So I'm going to actually have to go through and read the rule book over again. I want to make sure that I don't mess anything up and have everything the way it's supposed to be. But this is going to be another solo game. The first one that I will have played of Axis and Allies 1940. And the pieces that I'm using, I have both the first and second editions to the game. Not a whole lot of difference, really, in the games themselves as far as the game board or the mechanics of the game. It's mostly just some different sculpts for some of the pieces. Each of the countries had one or two new sculpts added to their inventory for the second edition game. So that's really the only difference. And I'm using a combination of both the first and second edition pieces. So, but it's obviously set up to 1940. So again, the political situation, you've got the Germans already having taken Poland. Several of their minor satellite allies are already under their control. They're poised on the border with France. Holland is also already fallen here. Another big difference is Italy is already in the war. So unlike Global 39, where the British cannot attack the Italians on their first turn because Italy isn't actually in the war. In this game, Britain does go before Italy again in the turn sequence. And since Italy is now at war already when the game starts, Britain is able to attack Italy. So commonly you'll see the British try to come in here and take out one or both of these Italian navies here. And unlike Global 39, they're actually able to do that. But other than that, Europe is all ready to go. The U.S. And Russia are not in the war at this point. And again, like Global 39, there's different events that can trigger the U.S. and Russia coming into the conflict sooner. I believe the U.S. can enter the conflict at the end of turn 3, and Russia maybe turn 4. I could be mistaken. Like I said, I've got to reread the rules real quick. But they could also enter before then, obviously, depending on certain conditions being met, or obviously an outright attack on either of them. In the Pacific, Japan is only at war with national China. So they do not have the ability to come down and like take the Money Islands or any of that without declaring war on the Western allies. Anzac is in this version of the game as well. The U.S. in the Pacific Theater, they've got their fleet in Hawaii and a decent fleet off of the West Coast. Japan, as you can see, very strong naval presence to start the game, and even more so maybe Air Force. I mean, they've got a bunch of planes in Manchuria, a bunch in Japan itself, loaded carriers all over the Pacific, and some more planes on the Chinese mainland as well. So we're all set to go for Axis and Allies Global 1940. This will be another turn-by-turn video, so we'll see you back at the end of turn 1. Okay, folks, we've completed turn 1 of Axis and Allies 1940, and a few interesting things happened in the first round, and then some typical maneuvering as well. So Germany goes first, and they came over and took all of France. I do sometimes see players leave southern France for Italy, but the Germans went ahead and took all of France itself. So Normandy, Bordeaux, Paris, and southern France. And the thinking there, as far as the Germans go, is kind of twofold. One, want to get Germany as strong as possible. They're obviously the heavy lifters for the Axis on the European side of the map. So wanted to get Germany as much income and get them as strong as possible. And then the other thing is now the Germans have a factory and a naval port here in the Mediterranean off of the coast there of southern France. So now they're able to, in subsequent turns, they can put down some transports here and transport ground units into Africa to not only help with Italy, but possibly get one of the bonuses Germany has is have ground units in Egypt. So Germany went ahead and took all of France. They also took Yugoslavia. They activated Bulgaria and Finland up here. They moved a bunch of their units towards the Eastern Front, or the future Eastern Front. So there's no danger of sea lion whatsoever. The Germans didn't even attempt to even throw the British off with that. The only thing Germany bought was they went ahead and bought a major factory, spent their $30 on a major factory, and they put that right in Romania. So again, totally telegraphing a assault on Russia, not too far in the future. So the Germans got a bunch of ground units. So they're all like men and artillery along the border with Russia. Now they do have that major factory in Romania to crank out 10 units a turn right on the border with Russia. They also transported a couple of men from Germany up into Finland. So now Germany's got a decent stack of men in Finland itself, and they got the 4 men from Finland when they activated it. So in Europe itself, Germany didn't suffer too many losses, mostly men. I don't think they lost any planes to AA or any combat at all. I think they lost 1 tank and the rest were men. But sea battles they engaged in didn't go so well. Now, they did come up here to Sea Zone 111, and they had taken out the British fleet there. But they attempted to take out the destroyer and the transport here with 2 subs and got no hits, lost both subs. They also brought a couple subs down here to Sea Zone 91 to try to take out this cruiser, and again got no hits and lost both the subs. And then they didn't have enough units to try to take out the fleet in 110. So the British still have a decent fleet left, and as you can see, the Germans have no subs on the board whatsoever. As far as the British went, they again had the fleet in 110 wasn't even attacked, but with all this German air power in Western Germany, they wanted to pull what fleet they had left over more towards the coast of Canada so that they avoid the range of the German planes. So you've got a battleship, a cruiser destroyer, and a transport, and then another destroyer and a transport over here by New Brunswick, Nova Scotia. The British then, for purchases, they went ahead and bought a miner factory that they put in Egypt, and then they had bought 2 tanks and a mech, which they put in the miner complex in South Africa. Not much else happened for the British. They kind of pulled back from Alexandria, only left a man there as a blocker, pulled everything else back into Egypt. So they got a pretty strong force there. As far as the Italians on this side of the map, the British did come in and attack the Italian fleet here off of southern Italy, and they took out that fleet and had a carrier and a cruiser, I believe, left over. And that was it for the British. As far as Italy, they were down to just 1 transport because the British had taken out a couple of their transports. So their 1 transport left came over here, landed a tank and a man in Algeria, took that. They also came over here to Tunisia with some ground units, took that. And then they pulled back from Tobruk, again, leaving just a blocker, and built up here in Libya, a pretty sizable force. They did go into Greece and took Greece barely. The 4 Greek infantry got 3 hits on the first round, took out a fighter and both Italian infantry. The Italians were just left with a tank and 1 fighter, but they stuck it out and got their 2 remaining Greek infantry out of there without losing anything else. Then the Italians did come over with the fleet they had in 95 and take out the remnants of the British fleet that had launched the Taranto raid here. This red chip under here isn't 5 battleships. It's just the damage marker because the battleship was damaged in the battle. Italy just saved the $10. They only get $10 to start the game with, so they just went ahead and saved that $10, and they're up to $16 right now, so they got an extra $6 worth of territories. As far as the U.S. on the European side of the map, they just bought transports. So they bought, I believe, 7 transports with their $52, saved the other 3. And all 7 transports they put here off the east coast of the United States, moved some units from central United States up to the east coast so that once the U.S. Can enter the conflict, they've already got a nice 8 transport fleet there to start bringing units over. As far as Russia went, obviously they see the writing on the wall here, and they went ahead and mostly pulled back from the territories bordering Germany. Bessarabia is not worth anything, so they completely pulled out of there. They left just a single man in these other border territories with Germany. They had bought 3 tanks, 3 men, and a fighter. The 3 tanks they put in Stalingrad, so they've got a little bit of a counterattack force down in southern Russia. The fighter was put into Moscow, and then Novgorod/Leningrad up here is where the Russians plan on making a stand. The 3 infantry they bought, they put there, as well as they pulled a bunch of infantry units that were in territory surrounding Novgorod and pulled them back in there. So now there's a stack of probably about a dozen or so infantry, some planes, and artillery, and some AA. So Russia's definitely presenting quite a bit of a nut to crack for the Germans up in Novgorod. On the Pacific side of the map, sticking with the Russians, not so good. On their turn, they go 2 in the sequence, 1 before Japan. So they went ahead and brought everything that was in these Far East territories and consolidated it into a Moor. So that was about 18 infantry and 2 AA guns. Japan can declare war on the Soviet Union at any time without triggering a state of war between them and the Western Allies, including the United States. So that was too much of a tempting target for Japan. So after the Russian turn and they had consolidated everything in a Moor, Japan attacked with everything they had from Manchuria, Korea, which was a bunch of ground units, mostly men, and then all the planes they had in Japan and a couple of ones that were on the Chinese mainland, and came in and took a Moor. They wiped out everything. The Japanese infantry, which only attack at a 1 in this game, on a 6-sided die, they have like 10 infantry in the battle, and like 5 of them got hits on the first round. So Japan only ended up losing infantry in the battle. They also brought a couple of transports over and landed in these couple of far eastern Russian territories. So Russia already is definitely feeling the crunch. I mean, you've got Japan has taken 3 territories worth only $1 apiece, but now there is absolutely no Russian units at all on the Pacific side of the map. So Japan is just going to be able to, even with these 1 movement ground units, slowly make their way. I seriously doubt they'd be able to get anywhere near Moscow to influence that, but they're at the very least going to be able to take up all of these Russian territories that are worth $1 apiece, and there's really not much anything Russia can do about it. So that was kind of different. Japan going ahead and attacking Russia on turn 1. They did not declare war on the Western Allies. Besides Russia, they just concentrated in China. So they brought all their ground units up 1 space, took out a couple of territories the Chinese had that had units in it. And as you can see here, they're poised to continue to march into China. Their entire air force, after combat movements on non-combat, came here, landed in Jiangsu. So they've got an entire air force, about 6 fighters, 4 tacticals, and a couple of bombers. So a nice offensive punch to go ahead with all the ground units they have. So China's already looking a little rough as well for the Allies. Japan had went ahead and purchased a minor complex that they put there in Jiangsu, and then a couple of transports they put in Japan. So now they can start moving some of the ground units in Japan itself off of Japan and get them in the fight. They also went ahead and combined all their naval units into 2 fleets. They got a fleet down here by French Indochina, a couple of battleships, a couple of cruisers, a destroyer, a sub, a loaded carrier, and then they've got another fighter on this island here. And then the second fleet they got here in the Caroline Islands, so a couple of loaded carriers, some destroyers, and a sub. So now they can go with the 2 fleets in a couple of different directions. As far as the Allies, the U.S. didn't spend any money in the Pacific. All of it went to the European side. They pulled the fleet from Hawaii back to the east coast, or the west coast of the United States. So they've got a nice looking fleet there. Loaded carrier, a battleship, a couple of transports, a sub, a couple of cruisers, and a couple of destroyers. And then they kind of made a run for it, seeing the writing on the wall with these Japanese fleets. So the sub and the destroyer that were in the Philippines are trying to make their way down here around the Money Islands, maybe make a break for the coast of Africa if they can make it that far. As far as the Far East Command, they came down and took Sumatra. They're able to do that without triggering any kind of conflict with Japan. So that was worth $4. And then besides that, they kind of just put up a couple blockers and a few territories bordering Japan, and then put 5 infantry down in India. That was really it. The battleship that was over in Sea Zone 37 moved out of the way, so now that's out over here by Calcutta as well, to hopefully get out of range of the Japanese fleet. Anzac had just $10, so they saved their $10. They did take a transport and a man and come up here and take Java, so that got them an extra $4 there. Besides that, they moved their 2 fighters from New Zealand over to Australia itself, and that was basically about it. So that's where things stand at the end of turn 1. I think the Axis got a good jump on the game. Germany is definitely poised already to make some serious headway into Russia. I don't know if they'll attack them here on turn 2. I doubt it, but probably turn 3 or obviously 4 at the latest. But the Japanese move against Russia paid off big time. I mean, not only did they completely wipe out all of the Russian units in the Far East and take those territories and leave the rest of those territories wide open, but now, even before Russia's at war with Germany, they already got all kinds of problems from the Japanese in the Far East. So the pressure, especially once Germany declares war on them, is going to really put a squeeze on the Russians. So the Allies got to kind of formulate some kind of strategy to relieve as much pressure on Russia as they can. Other than that, if we take a look at the money situation, so we've got the U.S. is at $52. They didn't lose anything. Germany went from 30 to 44. Russia went down 3 from 37 to 34. Japan went up 6 to 32. Britain lost just a couple to 26. The Far East Command went up. They're up to 21. Italy went up 6 to 16. Anzac went up 4 to 14. And then you've got China at 9 and poor France sitting there with $8 and no capital. So that's how things look at the end of turn 1. Round 2 just completed in this Axis and Allies 1940 global game. Not a lot of combat this turn. A lot of just maneuvering around. Let's start with Germany because they go first in each turn sequence. So there was actually no combat from Germany whatsoever. They're still not at war with Russia. Still have peace with Stalin at this time. So, and they had no ships on the board whatsoever besides this cruiser and this transport up here. So there was really nothing they could do. So they just kind of maneuvered around. For their buy, they went ahead and purchased 10 tanks and 4 men. And the 10 tanks they put down in this major factory in Romania. The 4 men they put down in Paris to kind of start beefing up Western Europe for a possible Allied landing on the continent. Other than that, they just maneuvered things around. They used this transport up here to bring a couple more guys from Germany up to Finland. All the tanks and mechs that were in Western Europe started making their way east. The men moved up, artillery, and all of the German Air Force. You got about 5 fighters and a couple strategic bombers there, and about 5 tactical bombers down in Romania. So as you can see, Russia's looking at a whole lot of German units coming their way. I would think that possibly the dam will break turn 3 here coming up, if not at the absolute latest, turn 4. The Germans have already amassed quite a bit. They got about 10 men up in Finland, a couple of stacks of men on the border with Russia. There's 10 tanks there. There's another like 8 tanks within 1 or 2 territories of Russia, as well as the entire German Air Force. So quite a bit coming Russia's way. And then again, besides that, the Germans dropped the 4 infantry down in Paris, and that was it for Germany. Really no combat at all. For Russia, again, going back to turn 1, the Far East is completely devoid of Russian units. So, and no factory out that way to kind of combat that. So they just concentrated on European Russia, built 3 more men in Novgorod. So you got a big stack of nearly 20 men in Novgorod. Down here in the Ukraine, they built 3 more tanks and moved up some men. So they've got a decent defense force, maybe a counterattack force down in the Ukraine, but it's still really not comparable to what the Germans can throw down in the south. And they also purchased another fighter. So that was basically all that Russia did. They're not at war with anybody but Japan, and there's nothing they could do to take on the Japanese, since they're devoid of any units in the Far East. So nothing really the Russians can do. Just wait for the inevitable German assault. As far as the British, they built 3 tanks and a strategic bomber. The strategic bomber they put in London, and the 3 tanks they put down in Cairo. They moved their navy back off of the coast of England because the Germans had pulled their entire air force east. So now there's no danger of the German Air Force bombing the British fleet. So they brought their entire fleet back over towards London. They also took a tank and a man from Quebec and brought them over to London. So the British building up a decent-sized fleet, and they got a handful of ground units in London, a couple of fighters, and a strategic bomber as well. So England's starting to put together a little bit of an offensive punch. As far as Africa, they had a bunch of good moves in Africa. They moved a bunch of units up one space to Alexandria, so starting to inch their way towards Libya. Again, they put the 3 tanks newly purchased into Egypt. Then down in southern Africa, they came up a couple of spaces. They got some tanks and some men. Down here, Belgian Congo, they've got a mech. They also attacked Anglo-Egypt Sudan, and they did lose a couple of units, but they took out the 2 Italian infantry and artillery there. So now the Italians in Central Africa just have a single man. So on this next turn, it looks like the British will be able to completely take over from southern Africa all the way up to Egypt. Really will be in their control. So that was good for the British. The Americans, they went ahead and purchased about a half a dozen men and 3 tanks. So now they've got enough ground units in the eastern United States to load up all 8 of their transports. They've got 8 men, 3 mechs, 4 tanks, and an artillery. So each of those transports will be able to take 1 man and 1 of those other units. So as soon as the U.S. is in the war, they can go ahead and use all their transports and bring those ground units over. That was about it for the U.S. on the European side. As far as Italy goes, they again saved their money. Was thinking about buying some transports to start moving some stuff around, but they don't have anything defending the transports, and the British could just use their Air Force to come over and take them out. So no sense in putting down the transports until I can put down some other ships to guard the transports. So Italy saved their money for the second turn in a row, so they've yet to spend $1. They did go ahead and take out the 2 French ships that were in Sea Zones 92 and 94. Again, this isn't 5 battleships altogether. That red ship signifies that battleship was again damaged in combat. But they did take out the 2 French ships. So now the Mediterranean is completely absent of any Allied warships. So the Italians are getting that $5 bonus. They also came over and took Morocco. So the western part of Africa is completely under Italian control. But they do have, again, the British coming from Alexandria, so we'll see. It's about even right now, but the British do have the advantage in the sense that they do have a industrial complex in Egypt, so they can put 3 units per turn on the board there, and the Italians don't have any complexes in Africa. So if the Italians want to continue to defend Africa, they're going to have to get transports on the board and start bringing stuff over. They also went ahead and moved a stack of about a half a dozen men and 2 artillery from northern Italy into Paris. So now between the Italians and the Germans combined, you've got about 10 men and about a half a dozen artillery pieces in Paris. Just building up a defense, the Axis are, for a possible Allied landing, maybe in Normandy, Bordeaux. And that was about it on the European side. On the Pacific side of the map, Japan continues to go wild. They did not, for the second turn, they did not attack the Western Allies. So they moved into a couple of empty territories and took a couple more dollars away from Russia here in the Far East. Again, there's no Russian units left at all, so this is just going to be easy money for Japan. In China, they went ahead and took a couple more Chinese territories, and as you can see, they're closing in on just the last couple of occupied Chinese territories there. So not looking good for the Chinese. And then they moved their entire fighter and tactical force, about 8 fighters and about 4 tacticals, down here in Siam. So obviously Japan is gearing up for a possible attack on the Far East Command, maybe this turn 3. They also went ahead and brought 3 transports down from Japan down to rendezvous with this fleet down here. So that took 3 men, 2 artillery, and a tank, along with all that entire fleet. So Japan is definitely looking to probably go on the offensive here, turn 3, in the South Pacific against the Far East Command. And that was really about it. They had bought 3 tanks that they put here in Guangzhou, and then 2 cruisers they put outside of Japan. That was about it for the Japanese. The Chinese did counterattack and took Yunnan back, so they reopened the Burma Road, so they got that $6 bonus back. But again, they're really down to just about Sichuan. There's a couple of guys in a couple other territories, but that's it. So China might be gone this next turn. We'll have to wait and see. Far East Command, they didn't want to provoke the Japanese, so with the Japanese not attacking them, they're kind of sitting things out still. They brought this transport and this guy from Sumatra over here to Sobeys and went ahead and got that $3. Besides that, they just bought 7 men, so they're building up a nice stack of men in India, and that was basically it. For Anzac, again, not much to do. They brought the man and the transport that were in Java back over here. There was no other money islands that are worth anything for them to land at, so no sense in just leaving the man and the transport over there. So they brought them back to Australia. They bought 3 men and put them in New South Wales, and that was basically it. Not a whole lot for Anzac to do yet. And for the U.S. in the Pacific, they did purchase a carrier, and they had 4 fighters already in the western United States, so 2 of those fighters are now on that carrier. So now they have 2 loaded carriers off of San Francisco. And that was it for turn 2. As far as the money situation goes, okay, we're looking at the Germans are at 44. If we take a look at the Axis first, they did not go up $1. Again, they just maneuvered things around. Japan at 37. Italy staying at 16. The U.S. at 52. They're still not in the conflict. The Russians are down to 32. British are hovering right around the high 20s at 27. Far East Command went up a couple more dollars to 24. Anzac at 14. And then France and China down at 6 and 7. So that's the economic situation. We'll see how things turn out in turn 3. Expecting that to be a big turn. Probably going to make the game a truly global war here on turn 3, with the Germans probably going into Russia and Japan attacking the Western allies in the Pacific. Turn 3 is in the books, and it turned out to be, in a lot of ways, a very good turn for the allies, with the exception of Russia. So the dam broke on the Russians this turn, and the war became a true global conflict. Both the Soviet Union and the United States is now in the conflict. So we'll take a look at Germany first. They went ahead and invaded the Soviet Union, came down into Bessarabia. Now, there wasn't any Russian units there. They had pulled back. But as you can see, between Bessarabia and then the one territory back, Romania, the Germans got a stack of like 10 tanks, 10 mechs, some men, about a half a dozen tacticals, and a couple of artillery. So they're well positioned in southern Russia. They came up and took the eastern Poland territory, as well as the Baltic states, and they had taken Karelia as well. So they had taken those 3 Russian territories, worth $1 apiece. So Germany went up a few dollars. But as you can see, the Russians had counterattacked. They moved some of their forces out of Novgorod and took Karelia back. And now by doing that, I mean, yes, it did weaken Novgorod, but the thinking was that Novgorod would probably have fallen anyways. So they wanted to get rid of that stack of about 10 German infantry there, and it also left Finland and Norway completely wide open. So now the Germans have nothing up there. So the Russians can make a little bit of dent in the German economy by going up north here. Novgorod probably going to fall this turn, though. The Germans got a stack of about a dozen infantry, a half a dozen tanks, some mechs in the Baltic states, and then even in eastern Poland, they got about a half a dozen men, 3 mechs, or 3 tanks and 3 artillery. And then they've got an air force backing them up, too, still in original German territory. So the Russians don't have a lot. I mean, Novgorod probably going to fall this turn. Same thing with the Ukraine. And that'll basically leave what they still have left up north here in Karelia, and then Moscow and Stalingrad. So not a whole heck of a lot going on for Russia. They started beefing up Moscow because they can see that their border defenses with Germany aren't going to hold probably more than maybe one more turn at best. So Germany definitely went on the move. They went up a handful of dollars in their economy and look pretty poised to continue the attack into Russia. They also had built those 10 mech in Romania this turn, and then put some more infantry down in France. So that was the good part for the Axis on the European side, but Italy is in all kinds of trouble. So the United Kingdom had moved naval units back into the Med, and as you can see, there's no Italian ships. The 2 remaining Italian ships in sea zones 92 and 94 were both killed. So now the Med is free of Italian ships. The Allies are back in the Med, so they're taking that bonus away from Italy. Italy also, the Americans are in the conflict, so they had brought their transports loaded with men, tanks, and mech and landed in Morocco, took that back from Italy. And now the Italians were faced with the Americans down over here in the coast of Western Africa and the British over here. So instead of just sitting and waiting to get crushed between the two forces, they launched an attack from Libya into Tobruk, tried to take out the British, and lost everything but a plane. And as you can see, the British still have tanks there. So the plane then retreated to the Italian mainland, and now Africa is totally devoid of any Italian units at all. So Italy is in big trouble. Also, Rome itself only has 2 infantry and a fighter. That's all the Italians could build. They did build 3 fighters they put in northern Italy, and then the men they had in France or in Paris and the couple of artillery pieces all retreated back to northern Italy. So the U.S. does have the option down here. They could come in on their turn and land in either Rome or northern Italy. Rome they would take with ease and obviously take the Italian money. But I think the Italians would be able to counterattack and take it right back. They've got about 8 men, 2 artillery, 4 fighters, and a tank. Against the U.S. down here has 7 men, 3 mech, 4 tanks, and an artillery. So they probably wouldn't lose hardly anything taking Rome. But again, I think the Italians would be able to counterattack right away. And the British don't have anything except for a couple of planes they could land to reinforce the United States. There's no transports the British have in the Med to bring over any ground units. So we'll see. The British do have a couple of 3 fighters here and 1 in Malta that they could land. So that'd be 4 more fighters. So the U.S. might try and take Rome. Because of the fact that it looked like Rome would be able to easily fall on turn 4, the Italians went ahead and spent all their money, and they were only collecting 13. So the U.S. isn't going to get a lot of money if they do take Rome this turn. I think 14 total. But yeah, things not looking good for Italy. Germany's going to probably have to bring some stuff down, like maybe these men in Paris are going to have to move out into northern Italy, maybe bring these fighter planes down. So that'll weaken the attack on Russia. But they got to try to, keep Italy in the war here. The U.S. went ahead and bought a bunch of men and artillery, I believe 8 of each, so that once these transports are done transporting this group here, they're just going to go back and pick up those U.S. units to land somewhere else, probably in Europe. It'll take a couple of turns because these transports are going to have to move into the Med, and then at least 1 or 2 turns to go back. So it'll be a little bit, unless the U.S. just buys new transports and doesn't worry about that kind of ferrying system. Other than that, that's how things shape up on the European half. The British bought some transports, so now they can start landing guys. As far as my thinking with Germany, they're definitely obviously going to push into Russia more and probably be able to take all of these territories they're currently bordering them with and really just leave the Russians with 2 territories that'll have pretty much any forces, Stalingrad or Volgograd and Moscow. But the Germans are also going to have to start putting money into the West. Again, they're probably going to have to retreat these fighters up here to help the Italians. So they might not even really put any money into the Russian front this turn. It might have to go all towards the West with the trouble Italy's having and with the U.S. and British both having transports and able to land pretty much anywhere they want. On the Pacific side of the map, again, the Japanese went ahead and attacked the Western Allies. So the U.S. is in the war as well as Anzac and the Far East Command. So with Japan, they continued to move further into the Far East here, Russian territories. They moved up another one, poised to keep going. So they're taking a territory, a turn from Russia, and they're each worth $1 up there. In China, continue to move up and position things a little bit more. The Chinese got a couple territories with a single man, and then Sichuan with about 8 men. So China could be completely done this turn, round 4 here. The Japanese also took 3 of the Money Islands. Celebes, Borneo, and Java all fell. And that's worth a total of $11. So a nice boost to the Japanese income. They also took the Philippines. They took French Indochina, and they took Kwangtung. So Japan's income actually jumped by quite a bit. I believe they were in the low 40s maybe, or maybe even the high 30s, and they're all the way up to 60 right now. So Japan definitely increased the income. They took Shan State. And then as far as their Navy, came down over here off the coast of Sydney and took out the couple of Anzac ships. So Japan poised to continue. Now the U.S. did move their entire fleet off the west coast of the United States over here to Hawaii. So they've got quite a bit. They got a battleship, a couple of cruisers, a couple of destroyers, a sub, a couple of transports with 4 men, the 2 loaded carriers, and a couple even extra fighters. So as you can see, Japan is pretty much defenseless besides like 4 men. And the U.S. with this naval port here can go 1, 2, 3 and actually land in Japan this turn. So Japan is definitely going to have to beef up the defenses of the of Tokyo there. They could retreat some of the Navy here, but the thinking with this is the U.S. really doesn't have enough ground forces to actually take Japan itself. So as the Japanese maybe just build a bunch of ground units to defend Japan itself and leave the Japanese waters free of warships, the U.S. can come over if they want. Because Japan really is now in a position, they've got 2, 3, 4, 5 transports with 10 total ground units. So, and their entire Navy is spread out in 4 different fleets here in the South Pacific. So they're in position, they can probably take Sydney, maybe not turn 4, but turn 5. So I think Japan is just going to go ahead and beef up the Japanese Tokyo itself with ground units and let the U.S. come over if they want. I don't think the U.S. is going to be able to take Tokyo, and instead just concentrate all their Navy down here in the South Pacific to taking out Sydney in the next couple of turns. They'll also continue to take the Money Islands. Sumatra can fall. They can take Hong Kong, or excuse me, Malaya can definitely fall this turn as well. Calcutta continues to beef up with infantry, and they also bought a couple of fighters, so that's going to be a tough nut to crack. But if Japan goes ahead, eliminates China this turn, takes a couple more, takes Sumatra and Malaya, and then continues to position themselves to take Sydney, Japan will be looking good. And then maybe the next turn, maybe start building up a navy around Japan itself to counter-attack the United States. So that's how things look at the end of round number 3. If we again take a look at the economics of it all, Japan is now in first place with $60. U.S. $51, but they do get $20 worth of bonuses, so they're still actually bringing in more. Germany in 46, Britain and Russia at 29, Italy and Far East Command both down to just 13, Anzac holding steady at 10, and then France and China bringing up the rear. That's how things look at the end of turn 3. Okay, turn 4 is now in the books, and some very interesting developments this turn. If we take a look at the European side of the map, Germany continued their advance into Russia. Several Russian territories fell here in turn 4. The Ukraine with that minor factory, the Western Ukraine, Belarus, and Novgorod with another minor factory all fell this turn. So, and the Germans still have quite a bit left, both up here in the north in Novgorod and down south in the Ukraine. So, the Russians just basically turtled up. They brought all that stack of tanks that was in Stalingrad, moved them up to Moscow, bought 10 more men they put in Moscow. So right now, Moscow's looking at about 20 men, about 10 tanks, some fighters, and a tactical. Definitely gearing up for the defense of Moscow here as the Germans are closing on the doorstep. It looks like the Germans will easily take these couple of territories, Smolensk and Bryansk, next to Moscow. So that'll be turn 5 here coming up. So then on turn 6, it looks like we'll have the battle for Moscow. The Germans probably have enough in Russia maybe to take Moscow right now. The Russians only have one more turn 5, to build units in Moscow for its defense. And the bad thing is that the Germans now have these 2 factories in Russia they can place units down on this turn 5. So those will be there for the attack on turn 6 of Moscow. So looks like Moscow could definitely fall on turn 6. The Russians did come up and took Finland and took Norway. So they took altogether $5 off of Germany, plus now Germany loses the $5 bonus for having Norway and Denmark. So that was good. Other than that, Germany dropped some units down in Western Germany and some more artillery in France, beefing up the defenses there, and then moved down a stack of men and a bunch of fighters and a couple bombers into northern Italy. As far as the Allies, again, Russia just came over into Norway and Finland. Besides that, just continuing to build up the defense in Moscow. They did come down and take Persia, get those couple dollars, and activate a couple of men. As far as the U.S., they did go ahead and make the landing in southern Italy, so they took Rome, and they took it fairly easily. There was only an Italian fighter and a couple of men there. The U.S. did have a stack of infantry there as well. They're now gone, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then the U.S. bought a bunch more transports to start transporting over these men and artillery they have in the eastern United States. They also took a couple territories in North Africa off of Italy. As far as the British, they built some more men and transports outside London, and then built 3 men in Cairo. They came over and took Libya. They also went ahead and landed 6 men, a mech, and a tank in Norway. So now they've got a little bit of force up here in the north to possibly come into Russia, maybe backed up with all these units. So actually, the Germans might have to do some scrambling to defend Novgorod. So the British putting some pressure, assisting the Russians up here north in Norway. They also went ahead and brought over a bunch of fighters that landed in southern Italy to back up the U.S. forces there. They also brought over their Mediterranean fleet so that these U.S. transports weren't so exposed. And that was pretty much it for the British. So now they've got a transport over here and all these ground units in Egypt. So now that transport could possibly land in Greece, start taking money away. So the Germans really have a bunch of different directions the Allies could come at them. So giving the Germans a lot of headaches right now. As far as Italy, they attempted to take southern Italy back. They launched an attack with these 4 fighters and tank that are in northern Italy, along with a couple artillery and like 6 men. And the U.S. on the first turn rolled lights out and took out all the Italian infantry and the 2 artillery. So at the end of the first turn, the Italian tank and fighters pulled back, and they managed to take out, I believe, 5 or 6 U.S. infantry and 1 mech. So what the thinking with that was, there was no way Italy was going to, take out these remaining tanks and British planes. So they pulled back to fight another day. Now the Germans are going to get to go here in turn 5 before the Allies, and they've got a stack of about 8 men, 5 fighters, and 2 bombers. So that should be more than enough to take southern Italy and wipe out this combined U.S.-British force there. So that'll get Italy back in the war. But they're not going to be collecting much money, and they can't even, they won't even be able to collect this turn. So Italy's still in really rough shape. Over on the Pacific side, you can see this huge conglomeration of this Japanese fleet down here. They all combined, landed in Australia. They also got a handful of men, some ground units, tank, and artillery. So Anzac is definitely feeling the pressure. Sydney could fall fairly soon, so Anzac just bought some more men and pulled everything back into Sydney to guard their capital there. The Japanese did buy 10 men that they put down in Tokyo to guard against this U.S. fleet over here off of Hawaii. They landed a couple of fighters there, continued to move up and take more Russian territory in the far east. Completed the conquest of China, so China is no longer in the game. Japan is in complete control of all of China. And they obviously have a huge Air Force presence, about 4 bombers, 4 fighters, a couple of tacticals, and some tanks down here in southern China, kind of at the doorstep with these Far East Command territories. They finished the conquest of the Money Islands, but now Japan actually is kind of in a little bit of a pickle too, because they don't really have a lot to worry about from this U.S. fleet here. There's only 2 transports with 4 men. So they can kind of let this U.S. fleet do what it wants up here, and they can just continue to defend Japan if they want to. Not really a danger of Japan itself being in trouble. But as you can see here on the Asian mainland, China or Japan does not have a lot of ground units here at all, and the Far East Command had been turtling for the last couple turns, and now they've moved out. So this stack of about a dozen men with planes has moved out 1 space, and now they're poised to really start eating up some of this Japanese territory. Now these men can only move 1 space per turn, but still, Japan's now faced with a dilemma. Do they bring this fleet off of Australia before they complete the conquest of Australia and come back here and maybe start putting pressure on the Far East Command so that they have to pull back and they can kind of secure their Chinese territories? Or do they let that go for the time being, possibly losing a bunch of Chinese territories, and instead try to finish off Anzac? Probably going to try to finish off Anzac, but we'll see. The U.S. did bring 1 lone destroyer down here from Hawaii. That moved to 3 spaces, 1, 2, 3, and now it's blocked off this Japanese fleet. So this fleet can come over, take this, out this destroyer obviously, but it won't be until the following turn, turn 6, that they'd be able to move 1 more space to go ahead and attack Sydney. And obviously these ground units could just make it their way over, but even the men can only move 1 space, so it'd still be 2 turns before they get to Sydney anyways. And the Japanese want to take advantage of all the battleships and the cruisers they have here for shore bombardment and land all these ground units by transport as opposed to having them attack by land anyways. So Sydney's going to hold on at least another turn and change. We'll see. Not sure the Japanese will have all the ground units they need. They do have 3 carriers. They have 3 fighters and 3 tacticals on there, so they have quite a bit of air power. But I think it's going to be pretty close. Anzac will drop another 3 infantry here on turn 5 before the attack on Sydney, possibly on turn 6. This Japanese fleet is more than a match for this U.S. fleet, so the U.S. is kind of stuck. Didn't want to bring this U.S. fleet down here to help Anzac out because this Japanese fleet would just totally crush it. So, and then again, no sense in going into Japanese home waters. They don't have nearly enough ground units to take Japan itself. So kind of stuck with this U.S. fleet, not sure what to do with it. They did buy another carrier and got 2 fighter planes on that. So maybe this turn for the U.S., maybe not put so much money into Europe and start putting money into the Pacific side of the map and build up another U.S. fleet to try to compete with this Japanese one. So that's where we stand at the end of 4 turns. Again, it looks like the Allies had a little bit of a resurgence this turn. I think turn 5, not a lot's going to happen. I think southern Italy will be taken back by the Axis, and Germany will continue to move inch closer to Moscow. But it looks like turn 6 is going to be is shaping up to be the turn of decision. It looks like turn 6 might be the attack on Moscow, as well as possibly in the Pacific, the Japanese attack on Sydney. And if that is the case, and both Moscow and Sydney go Axis, then it's going to, I think that'll pretty much close the book on this one for an Axis victory. But we'll see. As far as income goes, Japan is just running wild with the income. They're up to $73. The U.S. is at 56, Germany at 48, Britain at 30, Russia at 27, and then Anzac, Italy, Far East Command are all under 10. So that's the way things look after 4 turns. Turn 5 completed. And things continue to be kind of split right down the middle. This game can go either way. This turn 6 here that's about to come up is going to probably decide the game. So starting with Germany, they continue their inexorable march towards Moscow. They took Briansk here, and they moved everything they had into Briansk. So you've got about 20 tanks, 10 mechs, about a half dozen men, and 3 artillery pieces, all at the doorstep to Moscow. They also have 3 tanks, a tactical, and a couple of strategic bombers right behind. And then up here in Novgorod, they have another half a dozen tacticals that'll be able to reach. So they spread out a couple of mechs to take some territories here in northern Russia. The Russians just built 10 guys. So they've got about 30 men, 3 fighters, a tactical, and about 10 tanks. So Germany's got to go into Moscow this turn for a couple of different reasons. Not only this is about as strong as they're going to get in terms of an attack on Moscow. They don't want to let the Russians continue to put 10 guys down each turn. Then also the rest of Europe isn't looking as good for Germany, so they've got to take Moscow now. So we'll see what happens here. I think the odds are in Germany's favor, but I think it's going to be close, and that's going to go a long way to determining the game. The Russians moved out of Finland and Norway into Karelia, so they've got a force here that can possibly take Novgorod back this next turn. Although, again, if Moscow falls, it might be a little too late. The British went ahead and came over to Archangel, so they landed with men, a mech, and a tank, possibly to follow up the Russian attack in Novgorod or start taking some of these territories in Russia back from Germany. They also landed some more men in Norway, so the British got like a little bit of a flow going from England to northern Russia with these transports. Not a lot Germany can do about it. They also built some artillery in the United Kingdom. Southern Italy had fallen to Germany at the beginning of turn 5, and then the British came back and took it back because there was only a single German infantry left. And then at the end of turn 5, Italy came back and took Rome from the British. So Rome has changed hands several times just in turn 5 here. Right now, Italy's got 4 fighters and a tank. And then besides that, they have 2 AA pieces on the board, and that's it for the entire board for Italy. So Italy is in all kinds of rough shape right now. The British also put 3 transports down in this factory by Cairo. So now they can start moving these men and these tanks they have in Egypt all along any of the territories here in the Mediterranean. So definitely some trouble for the Axis in that regard. The U.S. started moving their fleet of transports out of the Med, going to start making their way back over here to the east coast of the United States to pick up some stuff. And then they came out here in the Atlantic. They've got 7 men and 7 artillery, backed up by some British ships to provide cover for the transports. So now the U.S. is able to land anywhere they want here in France. So another headache for the Germans. They went ahead and moved their 10 artillery pieces from France down to northern Italy, and they might have to move them down into southern Italy just to give Italy enough of a defense against a possible British invasion. But then at the same time, Paris is down to 5 fighters and 5 men, and you've got this U.S. invasion fleet force here ready to land here in turn 6. So the Germans got, a bunch of different headaches. They've got the British and the Russians up here in northern Russia ready to take Novgorod back, and the British continue to move men around with all their transports. You got this U.S. fleet of transports with these men and these artillery landing, and the Med. You've got all these British units ready to come over too. So the Germans got a bunch of different things they've got to defend against. If Moscow does fall this turn, then obviously the Germans can, not only will they take the Russian money, but they will then be able to start spending pretty much all their money back into Europe at all these different hot spots that the Allies are throwing up in Germany's way. So we'll see what happens in turn 6 as far as the European side of the map goes. The Pacific side, again, Japan continues to kind of run wild. They built 4 fighters, 3 tanks. The 4 fighters they put in Japan, the 3 tanks in Guangzhou, and then they bought 2 minor factories, one in Kwangtung and one up here in Shangtun. So they now have 3 minor factories on the Chinese mainland, producing 9 units a turn now, which they need to do that because the Far East Command has completely come out of India now. They've come out of their turtle mode and are slowly but surely making their way east. They took Shan State back from Japan this last turn. They've got these 2 stacks of men in back-to-back territories, a couple tanks and artillery and some fighters and a strategic bomber. So the Far East Command are ready to start taking up a lot of these southern Chinese territories from Japan. There's not a lot there. Japan does have in Kwangtung a stack of about 10 fighters, though. So there's quite a bit of a Japanese Air Force presence in China. And now with all 3 of these minor factories here, like I said, that'll be 9 units that Japan will probably put down this next turn. And the Far East Command mostly just has infantry. So that, obviously they don't attack. They only attack at a 1. So I'm not sure. It might be a little bit too little too late for Far East Command as far as coming out and trying to take on Japan. I think with these factories they got now on in China, Japan's going to quickly be able to pump out some units and start pushing the Far East Command back. But they had to, Far East Command had to come out and at least try something. I mean, if they just sat there and turtled up in India, it'd just be a matter of time, especially with Japan on the march pretty much throughout the Pacific. Down here in Australia, Japan did come over and take out the U.S. blocker that was there. But instead of moving the entire fleet up there, they went ahead and came around the south part of Australia here. So now the entire Japanese fleet, minus a couple of destroyers and a couple of subs, are over here. And now what they're able to do is go 1, 2, and land in Sydney this next turn. And there's nothing the U.S. can do. Even if the U.S. would have moved this fleet out this turn, 1, 2, 3, they wouldn't have been able to block this sea zone. So Japan, by moving around the southern part of Australia, now has put them in position that on turn 6 here coming up, they're going to be able to attack Sydney. And much like the battle for Moscow on the European side, this is going to probably determine how the war is going to ultimately turn out. Japan's got 3 tacticals, 3 fighters, about 6 men, a tank, an artillery. Plus, they're going to shore bombard with 2 battleships and 4 cruisers. They also have 5 strategic bombers here that should be able to reach as well. So, again, it looks like it's going to be fairly close, but I think Japan will take it. And if Sydney falls, it's going to probably be pretty much game over Japan's already collecting a ridiculous amount of money as it is. So we'll see. Australia, they only have a minor complex there, so they're only able to put down 3 units a turn. So they put down 3 more infantry trying to defend against this Japanese invasion. Another thing that is going to not only losing Sydney in and of itself and knocking Anzac out, but because Anzac is only a minor factory here and they're able to only buy 3 units a turn, they've got a bunch of money left over. So Japan's going to take all that money. So not good news for Anzac. As far as the U.S., again, this fleet basically stayed where it's at in Hawaii. It's still not strong enough to take on this Japanese fleet down here. So the U.S. didn't want to venture too far south here and put themselves in position to get attacked by the Japanese fleet. But the U.S. did spend pretty much all their money in the Pacific. They bought 2 battleships and 4 destroyers. So once these 2 fleets combine, then I think that's enough to put them on pretty much even terms with the Japanese fleet down here. So, but again, it might be a little bit too little too late. With Japan collecting so much money, they're going to probably be able to do an instant fleet here with their income pretty much anytime they want. As far as the money situation goes, and this tells a big part of the story, Japan's all the way up to $75, and even Germany now has tied the U.S. at 53, although the U.S. does get $20 worth of bonuses, so they're still significantly higher than Germany. And then Britain holding steady at 30. Russia's all the way down to 20. Italy just hanging in there at 10. And then Anzac, Far East Command, and France all under $10. So that's where we're at the end of 5 turns. Like I said, turn 6 here is going to pretty much determine things, I think, with both Moscow and Sydney under attack. Okay, so turn 6 is in the books. And some interesting developments. Let's start with Germany first again. So Moscow fell. The Germans came in, took Moscow. They've got about maybe about 10 tanks left. They also had some tactical bombers and a couple of regular strategic bombers that all survived. So Moscow fell fairly easily, and the Germans took I believe the Russians had about $33 in the bank at the time, so they took that. They also moved some newly purchased tanks from the Ukraine down into the Caucasus, so they're getting that bonus, and now they're on the doorstep to the Mideast to threaten the British down there. Besides that, the Germans built 10 tanks and put them in Paris because now that Moscow has fallen, Russia is for the most part under control, and the Germans need to start beefing up the defenses of Western Europe. That was pretty much it for Germany. So they were collecting about $60 along with the Russian money. So they're going to have over $90 to spend this turn. So Germany's looking pretty good right now. The Russians did come back and take Novgorod or Leningrad. So they took that. And that was about all the Russians can do. That's all they've got left on the board. They do have these 3 men down in the Mideast here. Thought about launching a suicidal attack against the Caucasus, but what's the point? The infantry defended at 2, attack only at a 1, so might as well keep them on the defensive, even though the Germans can just roll right through them with these tanks and these planes still. And that was it for Russia. As far as Britain, they kind of expanded out. They had landed here in Archangel, and they sent 3 men, separated them, and took 3 territories back from Germany. Now, the British don't get that money. It goes to the Russians, who cannot collect money right now because of the fact that their capital is under enemy control, but it still at least denied the Germans that money. And then the tank and the mech came over here and took the Urals back from Japan, again denying the Japanese $1. But now if you kind of look at the Far East here, Japan really has like nothing all along these territories up here. So the British could like make some headway, take these mechanized units and just move into the Far East further. And again, not give the money back to Russia because their capital is German right now, but at the very least deny that money to the Japanese. Besides that, the British built more transports and more men. So if you look in London right now, there's a whole mess of Allied units there. The U.S. also brought their transports and men and artillery over. So right now, both the British and the U.S. have about 7 transports apiece, and they're going to be able to bring total probably about 14 men and 12 artillery over on turn 7 here. So, and they can land pretty much anywhere here in Western Europe. So definitely giving the Germans some headaches there. The British also came down and landed in Greece. So they took $2 off the Italians. And now, as you can see, southeastern Europe here is completely devoid of Axis units. So Germany here on turn 7 is going to have to put down probably 10 units in this Romanian major factory to guard against this British incursion here into Greece. The British also moved up into Transjordan. They got to start worrying about blocking the Germans that might be coming into the Mideast there. The U.S. went ahead and moved this fleet of transports and a couple other ships from the Med. So on this next turn, they'll be able to make their way to the eastern United States and then start transporting some more stuff over on turn 8 if the game was to continue that long. The Italians actually were back in the game this turn. They only had, I think, $21 to spend because they had taken their capital back and got the money back from the U.S. before they could actually spend it. So they bought just 6 men, 3 in each of their 2 territories, and that's it. But they're down to just $8, so Italy's not really much of a factor whatsoever. The Germans did bring down those 10 artillery into southern Italy, into Rome there, so the Allies really don't have the power to take Rome back. So it looks like Italy might actually hang around a little bit now and maybe have a little bit of resurgence if they can, have a couple of turns of not having to worry about an invasion and just concentrate on building back up a little bit. Although, again, they don't have much money, so it's going to be difficult. In the Pacific, the Japanese did not attack Sydney on turn 6. These bombers in Java, these strategic bombers here, could not make Sydney and then have a place to land. And without those strategic bombers, actually Australia was more likely to win that battle. So Japan held off attacking Sydney. They did move these bombers down here into Western Australia, which they already own. So now those bombers can reach Sydney and have a place to land on turn 7 here. And Japan still has this huge fleet down here. So it looks like the battle for Sydney will take place here in turn 7. Anzac went ahead and purchased 2 fighters and a man. That's all they can put is 3 units there. The fighters, there was a couple of reasons for that as opposed to just 3 men. First of all, the fighters defend higher. But then also, if Sydney falls, they wanted to spend as much money as they could this turn to give the Japanese as little money for taking Sydney as possible. So they didn't want to just buy infantry, which are only $3 a piece, and then have like $20-something left in the bank. Then Sydney falls this turn and Japan gets all that money. So now by buying the more expensive fighters, there's only like $13 in Anzac's bank if Sydney was to fall this turn. Besides that, the Japanese, you can see this huge stack of fighters. That's about 12, 15 fighters there in Hong Kong. So Japan went ahead and bought 9 tanks, 3 in each of their minor factories here in China. They also brought fighters over from Japan because the Far East Command had a little bit of a resurgence. So they've come out from India, seeing as how Japan is going for Australia. They don't have to worry about an invasion of Calcutta. So they ventured out. They took French Indochina. They took Siam. They took Malaya back. So Far East Command went from, I believe, $7 up to $14. They pretty much doubled. Obviously took all that off of the Japanese. They also came up and took Yunnan. So definitely a little bit of a resurgence for the Far East Command. The problem is that, again, this huge stack of Japanese fighters, the air power alone Japan has in China, they're going to pretty much, just be able to come right back and take. Most of this is just infantry. So I don't think the Far East Command is going to be able to hold on to these territories very long. Again, Japan has these 3 factories in China that they can pump out 9 units a turn, and they've been putting tanks down. So Japan is poised to start taking some of these territories back right away. But, what was the other choice for Far East Command? To pull back into Calcutta and just kind of turtle up and wait for Japan to come and not really do anything. That's just going to tip the balance even more in the Axis favor. So they got to do something, even if it's just temporary. So give Japan a little bit something to think about. The U.S., again, they spent their entire build in the Pacific. They bought 2 more battleships and 4 destroyers that they put outside of San Francisco. They moved the 2 battleships and 4 destroyers they had bought the last turn to the Hawaiian Islands. And then they came down here and took the Caroline Islands from Japan, not worth any money, but it has both a naval port and a naval base, or a naval port and an air base. So they get the extra movement both for their aircraft and their ships. So they're strategically positioned here in the Central Pacific now. And that's a pretty good U.S. fleet. You got 3 loaded carriers, a battleship, 2 cruisers, a sub, a destroyer, 2 transports with 4 men. And as you can see, there's no Japanese ships at all in the Central to Northern Pacific. So the U.S. is kind of free to do what they want. Maybe they can land in the Philippines. Maybe think about landing on the Chinese mainland, maybe. Japan's pretty much not an option. There's about 15 Japanese infantry and 3 fighters there, so that's not going to happen. But at least the U.S. is building up a sizable fleet here, and these 2 fleets, the one in Hawaii and the one off San Francisco, they can combine those up, and they actually are going to give Japan a run for the money now in terms of what Japan has on the board for naval units. Japan might have to start thinking about pumping out some naval units in Japan, but then again, they've got to worry about taking all these territories back from the Far East Command. So the Allies have definitely had a little bit of a resurgence here, both Japan and Germany. The Allies are landing in a few different spots, kind of attacking them from a few different directions, forcing the Axis to spend money maybe where they don't want to, and to take back territory that they've had for a few turns now. So it's still, I think this game is still tilting towards the Axis. We'll see what happens down here. If somehow Sydney can hold, that won't affect this Japanese fleet, because obviously the Japanese aren't going to lose ships in an invasion of Sydney, but they would lose the aircraft and all the ground units. So then that would allow Anzac to take back all of Australia, and really pose the Japanese wouldn't be able to pose any kind of invasion of Australia, maybe for the rest of the game. They have no other, ground units even in position to be transported to Australia. So that's going to determine a lot. If Sydney falls, then obviously that might be the final nail in the coffin for the Allies, at least on the Pacific side. But again, the Allies trying to make a little bit of a comeback in Europe. We'll see. As far as finances go, let's take a look over here. So Japan at 70, but they were up to about 76, 77, maybe 78, somewhere around there. So they've fallen a little bit because of the Far East Command and Britain taking some territories back. Same thing with Germany. They were up to about $60. U.S. is staying firm at 53. Britain's up to 32. Russia, because of the help from Britain, back up to 16, although they don't collect that money. Far East Command up to 14, and then Italy and Anzac and France all under 10. So not just in terms of on the board, but economically, the Allies have definitely made a little bit of a comeback here. So we'll see if they can continue that into turn number 7. Just completed turn number 7 in this Axis Allies Global 1940 game. And we're plugging right along here. Some good news for the Allies, and then some not so good news. Looking over here at Germany, they sent some of their tanks that were left over from the Battle of Moscow, sent them out and taken back some of these territories the British had liberated. So now the British are just down to a couple of men in Leningrad, and this tank and this mech in the Urals, which will probably continue to make its way over into the Far East and take up these vacant Japanese territories, but the Germans got Russia back under control. They also came down here and took northwest Persia. They built 3 mechs in the Caucasus to start moving them, in Stalingrad, start moving them down into the Mideast. They put 5 men in Moscow that they had built just to beef up the defenses of Moscow in case the Allies were able to get that far. They also then went ahead and put 10 men in Romania to defend against the British incursion into Greece. And then they put 9 tanks into Western Germany. They also went ahead and pulled back the 10 tanks that were already in France and the 5 fighters. So now in Western Germany, you have 10 men, about 19 tanks, and 5 fighters. So more than enough to guard against any Allied invasion in the continent. And that was pretty much it for the Germans. The Russians then went. Again, they're not collecting any money, but they wanted to do something and not just sit back and wait for a German attack. So they came out, and there was a single German infantry in the Baltic states, so they took that with no losses. So, I mean, if the Germans somehow didn't take out this Russian force here, they're going to try to continue to make their way over towards Berlin. Don't really see that happening. I'm sure the Germans on this turn, these tanks can reach, these men can reach, planes can reach. So they'll probably take this out on turn 8 here, but the Russians had to do something. As far as the British, they didn't do a lot in Western Europe up here. They could have landed their forces with the U.S., but the problem is if they land anywhere in France, even with what the U.S. and the British combined can drop off in one turn, you're talking about maybe 15 men and about 15 artillery, best case scenario. So the Germans can immediately counterattack because the units in Western Germany, besides the infantry, can all reach anywhere in France on the next turn. So the Germans would then attack with 20 tanks and 5 fighters. So it's just not worth it at this point. You know, you're going to drop all those units into France and then have the Germans immediately counterattack and wipe them out. So if you don't land in France, you definitely can't invade Western Germany because then on top of everything else, they have 10 men. So then the only other option was to come up north here. But, you know, you're pulling your units away from where the main fight has to take place. I mean, I suppose you could land up here and maybe make a run for Moscow, get Russia back in the game. But again, the issue is the Germans already have 10 tanks and a handful of men and planes. And the Germans see you coming up this way, and they're immediately just going to pump units into Moscow. They can pump out 10 units a turn. And it would have taken these transports 2 turns to even land in Archangel. 1 turn to get up here by Norway, and then another turn there. So you're talking 2 turns, 10 units per turn. That's 20 more units the Germans would have been able to put in Moscow before you even land. So again, with the forces the Western Allies currently have available in London, it just did not make any sense to land anywhere. I know they don't want to just sit back and do nothing, but it really didn't make a lot of sense. So the British just simply built more transports, more artillery, and that was pretty much it in this portion of Europe. Down here in Greece, the British had an absolute disastrous attack. They went into Iraq here. The reason why they wanted to do that is so the Germans just couldn't roll in the next turn and get 3 free men. So they thought maybe they could take out. They went in with 2 strategic bombers, an infantry, and a mech. And on the first turn, the Germans rolled 2 2s, and the British only rolled enough to take out 2 of the infantry. So they had to take 2 casualties. They weren't going to take the strategic bombers, so they lost the 2 ground units and then retreated the strategic bombers. So that went absolutely nowhere. They did send a man up into Bulgaria and Albania, take a couple bucks there, landed some more tanks that were in Transjordan into Greece. So now they've got 6 tanks and a man there. But again, the Germans have already started reinforcing Romania, so it's going to be a race, and the Germans got more money, and they've got this complex that can drop 10 units per turn. So I really don't see the British sticking around, but it's a case of, you know, where are you going to go? You know, the Germans got factories all over Europe, 2 in France, 2 in Germany, 1 in Romania, plus the ones in Russia. And they collect so much money that they can just drop units, you know, before you can really get a foothold in the continent. As far as the U.S., again, they weren't going to land in the continent with the stuff they had in London. They're just building up. So they went ahead and purchased a bunch of men, 2 strategic bombers, and now they've got this fleet of transports ready to bring over all these men. So maybe this next turn, they'll go a couple of spaces out to maybe Sea Zone 104. And then maybe on turn 9, if the Allies are still in the game, they can land with all these units here in the eastern United States, along with everything in London, along with getting backed up with all the British stuff. So it might not be until turn 9 that the Western Allies can really land in Europe and have any chance of holding on to that territory. So we'll see. The game might be over by then, but the Italians really couldn't do anything. They bought 3 men, put them in southern Italy, brought some stuff down from northern Italy, so they're beefing up Rome. Not that Rome is really in any danger right now, but Italy's only collecting $7, so not much going on. In the Pacific is where we had some pretty big action. On the Chinese mainland, the Japanese went ahead and built 9 more tanks, 3 in each of their minor factories, flew some more fighters from Japan over to Hong Kong here. They went on the offensive and took back a couple of the territories that the Far East Command had taken the turn before. And now the Far East Command sees the writing on the wall and are just pulling back. It was like a minor excursion for one turn, and they're already pulling back. I mean, if you look at what Japan has here, they've got stacks of tanks all over the board. Not a ton of tanks, but there's 5 here, 2 there, 6 there, 3 there, 6 up in these 2 northern territories. So they've got a bunch of tanks. They've got a stack of a good 20, maybe even more fighters. There's just no way, with mostly infantry and a tiny air force, there's no way the Far East Command is going to be able to do much of anything. So they pulled back, kind of turtling again in Calcutta, hoping the United States maybe can intervene before Japan's at the doorstep, but it's looking pretty bleak for the Far East Command. I mean, there is a ton of Japanese stuff, especially that air force in China, ready to roll towards Calcutta. As far as the United States goes, you've got a situation where, yes, they could have come over, they could have taken the Philippines, they could have maybe even landed on the Chinese mainland here, but either way, this is a stack of about 22 Japanese fighters. You land over here in the Philippines, these fighters and the 2 tacticals can reach, and the Japanese, that's decidedly in Japan's favor, that battle. And now you completely wipe out this U.S. fleet. The transports, the men are stuck on the Philippines. I mean, what's the point? Same thing with landing on the Chinese coast. So the U.S. unfortunately didn't do anything. They brought a couple battleships and destroyers down to this sea zone. So now they've got a big fleet that's amassing in the Carolines. And then 2 more battleships and 4 destroyers came down from off San Francisco down to Hawaii. So the U.S. has got quite the fleet going in the Central Pacific. All their money, though, was spent on the European side of the map this turn. And then the big news was Australia. Sydney held on. It came down to the last turn. Anzac had an artillery and 5 fighters, and Japan had a tank and 4 strategic bombers. And Japan got 5 hits. All 5 of them hit. So Anzac took 4 of the fighters and the artillery. The artillery then missed, and then all 5 Anzac fighters hit to wipe out the last 5 Japanese units. So Anzac survived with a single fighter. So as you can see, the Japanese fleet's intact, but there's absolutely no planes down here at all. And then for a build, Anzac did put a fighter and a man in Sydney. So Sydney held. And as you can see, looking at the Southern Pacific here, there is no Japanese units, no ground units that these transports can pick up really or anything. So the attempted invasion of Sydney failed, and I don't see Japan being in a position to try again anytime soon. I think Japan's going to mostly focus on the Far East Command now and take them out. But Japan's got their hands full. This is a big U.S. fleet, and now it's about on even terms. And actually, with the U.S. having planes and Japan not having planes with this fleet, I actually think the U.S. would pull that off. So it's going to probably be a case of Japan trying to make a run for it, get away. But, either way they go, 1, 2 spaces here. The U.S. can go 1, 2, 3. So I don't think Japan's going to be able to get away before this U.S. fleet can catch them. So if the U.S. can do that, they'll have the Pacific, at least in terms of naval power, completely to themselves. So it could start to tilt the balance of power in the Allies' hands. As far as money goes, again, we've got Germany and Japan, 73 for Japan, 58 for Germany. U.S. holding steady. Britain went up a couple of bucks, and everybody else bringing up the rear. The Allies are still holding on. Both Britain and the U.S. are doing a lot of good things. It's just I'm not sure it's going to quite be enough to win the war for the Allies. Round 8 is now in the books. And let's take a look. We'll switch it up a little bit. Let's look at the Pacific side of the map first. So Japan, again, for their build, they put down 8 fighters and a tank in Japan. They didn't put anything on the Chinese mainland this turn. They went ahead and moved a bunch of units up. They took a couple of territories back from the Far East Command. Shan State, they took back. They moved up a big part of their Air Force down here. And they still have quite a few tanks. So they're just a couple of territories away from Calcutta. And with this big stack of Japanese fighters here, I don't think Calcutta is going to be able to hold. Again, it's going to take Japan one turn to take out Burma here on turn 9, but by turn 10, they'll be in a position to probably take India. They had also moved their fleet from Sea Zone 62 over to north of Australia here. And they did that so that they had their 6 carriers here that didn't have any planes on them. So by moving them up here, they were able to fly 6 fighters from the Chinese mainland to land on the carriers to give the carriers a little bit more protection. And that was a good thing because we had the biggest fleet battle of the war so far. The United States came down from the Caroline Islands, and it didn't go so good for the U.S. That's what's left of the Japanese fleet. They had 4 fighters, which 2 of them were able to land in the Northern Territory of Australia because Japan already owned that. They still got 1 carrier with 2 fighters and 2 battleships. The U.S. lost like 3 battleships, 3 loaded carriers, 6 planes, like 5 destroyers, a couple of subs. They lost everything. But the thinking for the U.S. at that point is the odds were about 50-50, maybe slightly in Japan's favor. But the game is definitely, each turn that goes by, the game is definitely tilting more and more in the Axis favor. Both Germany and Japan are just collecting so much money that the Western Allies just can't sit back and wait, even if they have to take a few chances and maybe engage in some battles where the odds aren't in their favor. They got to do something. They can't just sit back. So the U.S. went ahead and did launch that attack. And again, they lost their entire fleet. But the good news is, and this was another thing that factored into the U.S. thinking, was that they did have this small fleet of a couple battleships and 4 destroyers coming from Hawaii. And they put down on their build 2 battleships and 3 cruisers. And as you can see, Japan has nothing in the Pacific in the way of ships besides what's still left from this battle. So the U.S. knew that even if they would have lost, as long as they took a big chunk of the Japanese fleet, which they did, the U.S. still actually has more ships in the Pacific than Japan does. So that was a big battle. Australia just barely hung on, if we remember from the last turn. So they just built a couple of men this turn to try to put some defense into Sydney, although Japan has no transports on the board, so Sydney isn't in danger of being invaded. The U.S. also came over and landed in the Philippines, so it took $2 back from Japan there. The Far East Command, again, kind of, in terms of what they did, is the same kind of thinking as the U.S. Here in Burma, the Far East Command had about 6 men and a couple of tanks. So they ventured out to Shan State along with, I think, 5 fighters and a tactical. And this was a stack of 14 Japanese tanks. Again, the odds were only about 50-50. And yes, they did need those forces for the defense of Calcutta. But, if you just pull back into Calcutta and turtle up as the Far East Command, Japan's just going to eventually roll over you. So they took a chance to try to, if not necessarily wipe out all these tanks, at least whittle them down, which they did. There's only 5 tanks left. So they took out 9 Japanese tanks, but it cost them all the infantry, both tanks, and even more important, it cost them 3 of the fighters and the tactical. The Japan on the last round of the combat rolled really well and just wiped out. They didn't want to really obviously lose any of the planes, but they took a chance and then pulled back what was left. And that's pretty much it for the Pacific. Again, things are shaping up to look like the Far East Command is not going to be hanging around much longer. In Europe, as far as the Germans go, they went ahead and took back Leningrad up here, wiped out the Russian units that were in the Baltic states. So now there is no Russian units left on the board at all except for a single sub over here by London. Other than that, Russia's completely out of the game. And as you can see, all of Russia, for the most part, is totally in German hands. All the territories that are worth anything, Germany will be able to come up on this next turn and take back Finland, Karelia, turn after that, Norway. So Germany's collecting a massive amount of money for having all of Russia under control. They also continue to move further down in the Middle East. They're now down into Iraq. They got 3 tanks and a man there. And then right behind that territory, they've got 3 mechs and a half a dozen tacticals. So they're starting to make their way to possibly coming over into Africa. Besides that, the Germans just put everything into Western Europe, bought a bunch more tanks and more men. So now in Western Germany, they've got about 20 tanks, about 20 men, a fighter. And then in France, they've got about another 10 men. They got 10 artillery pieces that moved up from Rome, up one spot. So now they'll probably move back into Paris this next turn to guard against a possible Allied landing somewhere in France. They also put some money into Romania. They built 6 tanks down there. They had taken back Bulgaria because of the English incursion into Greece. So now Germany's poised to take back those territories. So the British went ahead and pulled back what they could from Greece because obviously the writing's on the wall here. The Germans have got too much and can put resources into Romania there with that major complex. So the British pulled back as much as they could. What they couldn't pull back because they didn't have enough transports, they just went ahead and attacked Yugoslavia and took those couple of dollars, which the Germans will just take it back right here, but not much Britain could do there. Besides that, Britain built 3 fighters, put them in London, and also 3 men that they put down in Cairo because, again, you've got this German force coming over from Iraq. So they got to start thinking about defending Africa. And then this is the big move from both the U.S. and the British over here. So the British finally came down following the U.S. lead. And there's a whole lot of transports, men, artillery, and planes coming. So now positioned here in a sea zone that has this naval base at Gibraltar, so they can move 3, so they can come into the Mediterranean, they can land anywhere in Italy, or they could even come back up and land somewhere in France. So altogether, the British they've got some ships, a battleship and a cruiser for shore bombard, but the British have 8 transports, and that's 8 men and 8 artillery. And then the U.S. has got about 15 transports with about 30 men and about 7 artillery, roughly. Along with the U.S. has 4 strategic bombers. So they've got a bunch of units here. I think they're probably going to go towards Rome. Rome isn't that well defended. Italy isn't making hardly any money. So they might come into Rome, and that's going to be way more than enough. That's going to be overkill to be able to take out Rome. So we'll see how things go. The only problem is for the Allies, and as far as on the European side of the map is, again, Germany's making so much money. They're up to $67, but besides the $67, they're making a ridiculous amount in bonuses. They get $5 for each of Leningrad, Stalingrad, and Moscow. So that's 15. They get $2 for 3 of the territories they have down here: Northwest Persia, Persia, and Iraq. So that's another 6. So that's 21 extra dollars in bonuses on top of the territorial income they have. And again, the Germans have so many industrial complexes spread throughout Europe that even though this is a massive force and can land pretty much anywhere it wants, the only place it probably couldn't land is Western Germany. Anywhere else they can land. But not only the Germans already have quite a few forces in Western Europe, they make so much money, and with these industrial complexes, they can just drop stuff down at will, and can reinforce quicker than the Western Allies can bring more units over with transports and whatnot. So they're going to go for it. No sense in waiting any longer. The Axis are really getting close and closer to a victory. So they're going to go ahead and land. The initial landing will be totally fine. They'll take Rome, knock Italy back out of the war. But then, like I said, the Germans can just pump units into Paris. There's a major. In Western Germany, there's a major. In Berlin, there's a major. Romania, there's a major. So I just don't see how the Western Allies are going to stay once they land. But nothing else they can really do. And then as far as the income goes, as you can see, Japan's way up there, 71. Germany's right behind him at 67. The U.S. holding steady at 55. Britain's in decent shape at 35. And then Italy, France, Russia, Anzac, Far East Command, all under 10. But if you take out these countries up here, okay, take out Italy, Far East Command, France, Russia, they're pretty much inconsequential at this point. It's basically a 2-on-2 contest. And just look at the income. 71 and 67 for the Axis. That's $138, and 55 and 35. That's 90 for the Western Allies. So just economically, it's not looking good after turn 8 for the Allies. Turn 9 is now in the books, and a couple of good things for the Allies, but this game, with each passing turn, is looking more and more like it's going to be an Axis victory. I don't really see the Axis are just collecting too much money, and they can just respond to pretty much any threat that the Allies pose at this point. So I'm just not sure there can be. I don't really see a way that the Allies can win. But we'll take a look. So here in Europe, Germany came down for their purchases. They bought 8 Stukas and 3 men. The Stukas they put in Western Germany, the men in Paris. They came down and took Yugoslavia and Greece from the British. So they expelled them from the continent there. They also continue to move up in Russia. Again, as you can see, there's no Russian units on the board here in Russia itself. So Germany's free to just maneuver around. They came up and took Karelia and Finland. They're poised to take Norway back next turn. Moved a couple of tanks down, a couple more tanks down into the Mideast, around the doorstep to the Mideast. And if you just look between just 2 territories, Western Germany and Paris, the Germans have a massive amount of forces. That's about 20 tanks, 20 men in Western Germany, along with now 8 Stukas and 5 fighters. And in Paris, you probably got about 20 men and 10 artillery. So just like a massive amount of units. Just don't see how, even with a successful landing by the Western Allies, how they're going to combat that. And now, honestly, Germany really has things so secure, except for in Italy, which we'll get to in a second. But they really have things so secure on the continent that now probably going to start purchasing some transports. So as you can see, England's moved almost everything out of London for their Mediterranean invasion. So they've just got a handful of fighters. So if the Germans, let's say, do on this turn buy like 10 transports, the British are going to be able to do nothing but buy men, spend all their money here in London to guard against that invasion. So the Germans really have a lot of options. As far as the Western Allies, they did go ahead. They took Rome. So the U.S. came first took Rome rather convincingly, knocked Italy pretty much completely out of the war now. There's not a single Italian unit left on the board. Got Italy's money. And then the British followed up. They landed a guy in northern Italy to take that empty territory, and the rest they landed in southern Italy to beef up the U.S. defenses there. So that does look like quite a bit, and it is. You've got, altogether between the U.S. and the British, you've got probably upwards of 30 men and 20 artillery. So a nice size force, but again, the problem is, the Germans can bring all these men and artillery into northern Italy from Paris, and they can bring all the Western Germany is adjacent to northern Italy, so all these tanks, all these men can come down. So if the Germans did that this next turn, you're talking about 30 men, 20 tanks, and 10 artillery in northern Italy. And now you've got this Western Ally invasion force bottled up in southern Italy. So, again, it's just the Germans can react pretty much anywhere the Allies land. And I just don't really see that force being able to defend against everything that Germany can throw at it. But again, it's getting late in the game. The Allies had to do something. So the good part is they did knock Italy out. Over here in the Mideast and in Africa, the Germans brought some more stuff down. So they've got a bunch of Stukas, a couple of strategic bombers, some tanks, and some mechs at the doorstep to Transjordan here. So the British also have worries down here. The Germans are building up enough. I think with what the Germans have here, that's obviously enough to take Transjordan, which only has a single man in it. But even Cairo here is severely threatened. So England's going to probably have to put some more units into Cairo. Again, if it looks like they can't hold, they might even have to pull out of southern Italy. Both the U.S. and the British do have all these transports, so they can move these guys around anywhere. But if you don't stop and make a stand at some point, then it's really kind of pointless, especially if the Germans do go ahead and buy a bunch of transports this turn. In the Pacific, another naval battle occurred. The Japanese came up from Sea Zone 55 and came up into 33 and tried to take out what was left of the U.S. fleet and actually got completely wiped out besides a single fighter, which landed over here. So that didn't go so well for Japan. For purchases, they bought 3 aircraft carriers, and they had plenty of fighters already in Japan that could land on the carriers. So you've got already 3 loaded carriers just like that for Japan. And they put 3 mechs in Kwangtung. As far as down here by Calcutta, you can see there's really no Japanese ground units, but there's also almost nothing left in Calcutta. So Burma had been retaken by Japan, and they had a stack of about a dozen tanks, a couple of men, and a couple of artillery. So instead of just simply waiting for the attack to come as India, as the Far East Command, because you've got all these Japanese planes, so Calcutta definitely would have fell here on turn 9. So the Far East Command went ahead and sent out all their infantry. They had a stack of about 15 infantry and I think 3 fighters. Came out, attacked Burma. They were hoping to actually survive with at least 1 ground unit, so they would have held Burma. So that would have been a blocker against the Japanese, so they could have held on for a couple of more turns. But they actually did good in terms of wiping out all the Japanese units, but they literally lost everything. It came down to the last die roll, and Japan hit on their last remaining couple of tanks and took out everything. So there was a mutual destruction there. The Japanese don't have any ground units that can reach Calcutta on this next turn. This mech in Malaya is 1, 2, so it's 2 turns away. So India will hold on for at least another couple of turns, at least 1 turn, and then maybe fall on turn 10. But that's inevitable. Plus, even the Germans got some stuff kind of at their back door that they could bring down if they really wanted to, if they didn't think Japan could. But this is a stack of about 15 fighters, so even with a single mech, they could come in, not this turn, but on turn 10, and take fighters as casualties just so that the mech can survive and actually take Calcutta. And right now they have 3 infantry and 3 AA in there, and they only get they only have about $6 in the bank, so they're only going to be able to put 2 more guys down there. So Calcutta will definitely fall on turn 10. The Anzac went ahead and spread out a little bit, trying to take back the territories the Japanese owned in Australia. The U.S. Moved what was left of the fleets in the Carolines back to Hawaii, moved down what was off of San Francisco down to Hawaii. So now they got a nice fleet in Hawaii of 4 battleships, 3 cruisers, and a destroyer. And then for their purchases, they spent all their money here in the Pacific, 7 subs and 2 battleships. So building up quite the fleet. But again, I think it's a little bit too little too late for the U.S. The Japanese collect in quite a bit of money themselves, so they're able to pop down insta fleets pretty much if they want to as well. As far as the financial situation, you've got Japan and Germany still. It's top dogs at 74. The U.S. is at 58, and they do get, I think, 25 worth of bonuses. So they're actually bringing in more than Japan, counting their bonuses. England's still holding steady at 36, and everybody else is under 10. So don't expect a lot to happen turn 9 here, but I think by turn 10, the Germans might be in position to take London, and Japan will definitely take in Calcutta, and that could be the end of it. Okay, folks, so we're going to call it. This is going to be an Axis victory here in Axis Allies Global 1940. I believe this is the end of turn 13, maybe. The last video I did was, I think, at the end of turn 9, and I skipped ahead a couple of turns as far as not making any videos just because things were going so good for the Axis that the turns were, I was getting through them a little bit quicker. There wasn't a whole lot the Allies could do. So just played out the last couple turns. Like I said, I believe we're at the end of turn 13. And the Germans on this last turn were able to take London. Just a single tank is left, but London did fall. A couple of turns back, they had taken southern Italy back and got Italy in the game. Although Italy's only got the 2 infantry on the board there. So this really on the European side was pretty much a complete German effort, really. Italy didn't do much. They were pretty neutered from early in the game by both the United States and Britain, actually. But the Axis do hold 8 of the 11 victory cities on the European side of the map here. They have London, Paris, Berlin, Rome, Leningrad, Moscow, Stalingrad, and Warsaw. So that's 8 of the 11. The 3 remaining, one of them, Cairo, is in danger. Probably 2 more turns of the game, and Cairo would fall. With London having been occupied, the British don't get any money. They've got a stack of about 8 men, 3 tanks, a couple of strategic bombers. But just here in northwest Persia alone, the Germans got about 10 tanks, a couple men, a couple of mechs, about 8 tactical bombers, a couple strategic bombers, and they got a bunch of stuff coming right behind in the Caucasus and in Stalingrad. So I figure probably 2 turns, maybe if the British have these blockers in place here outside of Cairo, maybe 3 turns, but no more than 3 turns, and Cairo is definitely going to fall. There's nothing the Allies could do about that. The other 2 victory cities, Washington and Ottawa, not in any danger of being taken anytime soon. But if you look at what the Germans got on the board here, that's a stack of 10, and that's another stack of 10 transports, so 20 total transports. And those can transport 40 ground units. So again, it would have taken the Germans a few turns to get over here, but they've got already the transports necessary to make a successful landing in North America. So again, it would have just been a matter of time if you continue to play the game out. Other than that, with London falling, England doesn't have much on the board. They got a little bit of fleet here that's trying to make its way to east coast of the United States. Some transports up there with no ground units to transport. So it was really just the United States left on the European side of the map. And even though Italy's not a factor, they're only collecting $8 plus $5 for the bonus because there's now no Allied ships in the Med. Still, they weren't a factor at all. But just Germany against the U.S., that one-on-one battle was going to be something that there's no way the United States could win, even if they focused everything they had on the European side of the map. Germany right now is collecting $84 worth of territory. And even more impressive than that, they get $31 a turn in bonuses. So the $31 in bonuses alone is more than half of what the United States is bringing in. The Germans are getting $5 for having Norway and Denmark, $5 each for Leningrad, Stalingrad, and Moscow. So that's 20. $5 for the Caucasus. That's 25. And then $2 each for Iraq, Persia, and Northwest Persia for a total of $31 on top of their $84 worth of territory. So there's no way the Allies were coming back from that. On the Pacific side of the map, things don't look a whole lot better for the Allies. Calcutta had fallen a couple turns ago, and then the U.S. did a last-ditch effort to take Calcutta back, I believe on turn 12 maybe it was. They didn't really have a lot of offensive punch, a bunch of men and artillery that had landed here in West India, along with a couple of, I believe 4 it was, strategic bombers. But they had to try to get Calcutta back. It failed, and now as you can see, there's nothing anywhere near putting Calcutta in danger for Japan to lose that. Japan's up to collecting $77, and then they get $10 worth of bonuses, 5 for Calcutta and 5 for having all the money islands. So $87 a turn they're bringing in. And if you look at here, the last few turns, Japan has been putting all their money into naval units. This is a massive fleet here in these two sea zones. You've got a total of 7 aircraft carriers with 2 fighters apiece, 4 battleships, half a dozen subs, and a half a dozen destroyers, along with 7 transports and 14 men, or maybe, 12 men and a tank, I think, is left there in the Philippines. So that massive force making its way down to Australia. Now, the U.S. and Australia have kind of combined a fleet here, and it's pretty formidable. You've got 4 U.S. carriers with 8 planes. I think that's 6 battleships, about 8 subs, 3 Australian cruisers, 3 U.S. cruisers, and 3 U.S. destroyers. So it wouldn't be a pushover for Japan, but I think Japan's got enough up here that they would be able to take that fleet, and then there would be nothing to oppose the landing of the 12 men and the tank. And Australia doesn't have a whole lot left from when Australia was invaded, when Sydney was invaded maybe 5 turns ago or so. They whittled down Australia's defenses pretty good, so you're down to like 3 fighters and a half a dozen men or so. So Sydney almost definitely would have fallen a couple of turns as well. As it stands, Japan holds 5 of the 8 victory cities on the Pacific side of the map. They've got Calcutta, they've got Hong Kong, they've got Shanghai, they have Manila, and they have Tokyo. So the only ones that aren't in their reach are Sydney, Honolulu, and San Francisco. Now, both Honolulu and San Francisco seem pretty secure, but again, Sydney probably would have fallen within a couple of turns. And again, Japan's making more money than the U.S., so they're able to build up more of a fleet. I mean, at some point, even Honolulu would probably come under threat from this Japanese Navy. Not to mention that with Germany now having England out of the way, they would be able to concentrate on just buying naval units and transports themselves and start threatening the east coast of the United States so that the United States wouldn't be able to dump all their money in the Pacific side of the map like they have been for the last 3 or 4 turns. So that's altogether 13 of the victory cities are under Axis control. Germany and Japan both are 1-2 in income right now. So they're just able to buy just way more units than the Allies can. England now pretty much out of the game. There's no chance that London's going to be recaptured. So we're going to call it an Axis victory after 13 turns. And we'll get another game set up here and see if we can get the Allies on the winning side for once. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back soon.